Before dawn on June 22, 1941, the largest invasion in the history of warfare began along a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. German artillery opened fire, aircraft struck Soviet airfields, panzer groups crossed borders that Adolf Hitler had promised less than 2 years earlier to respect. The operation was called Barbarossa. Its first hours looked like another shocking German victory. Contemporary records, later source evidence, and historians' estimates all point to the same context and cause. Hitler's regime mistook rapid operational success for strategic capacity. Its deeper meaning was far larger. Nazi Germany had opened a war it was not able to finish, and it had turned the Second World War into a struggle of almost unimaginable scale. The invasion did not come from nowhere. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. Publicly, the agreement stunned the world because two bitter ideological enemies had agreed not to fight. Secret protocols divided parts of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Within weeks, Germany invaded Poland from the west, and the Soviet Union moved into eastern Poland. For Hitler, the pact was never a lasting settlement. It was a temporary arrangement that gave him time to defeat enemies in the west before turning toward the east. Hitler's eastern plans were ideological as much as military. He did not see the Soviet Union simply as another enemy state. Nazi thinking imagined a racial empire in the east, with land, food, labor, and resources taken by force. The campaign was connected to anti-communism, anti-Semitism, colonial ambition, and plans for mass starvation and occupation terror. That makes Barbarossa different from a conventional border war. It was designed as a war of conquest and annihilation. The goal was not merely to defeat the Red Army, but to remake Eastern Europe under Nazi domination. German planning assumed speed would solve almost every problem. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland quickly in 1939 and defeated France in 1940. Those victories encouraged the belief that deep armored thrusts, air superiority, encirclements, and operational shock could destroy a state before its reserves and industry fully mattered. Against the Soviet Union, that assumption was dangerous. The Soviet state covered immense distances. Its population was enormous. Its industry could be moved, rebuilt, and expanded. Its army had weaknesses, including purges, poor readiness, and command confusion, but it also had depth. On the morning of June 22, three main German army groups drove east. Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad. Army Group Center struck through Belarus toward Smolensk and Moscow. Army Group South pushed into Ukraine, where grain, industry, and the road toward the Black Sea made the region strategically vital. The front was so vast that no single map can make the first day feel simple. It was an attack by millions of men, thousands of aircraft, and thousands of tanks, supported by allies of Germany and aimed at destroying Soviet power before winter. The first weeks were catastrophic for the Soviet Union. Many aircraft were destroyed on the ground, communications failed, whole armies were surrounded in massive encirclements at places such as Minsk and later Smolensk and Kiev. German reports counted prisoners in staggering numbers. Cities, rail lines, and command networks fell under pressure. To outside observers, it could appear that the Soviet Union was collapsing the way France had collapsed the year before. But early disaster was not the same as final defeat. One reason was geography. German forces had to move across roads that often became dust in summer and mud in autumn. Rail gauges differed, so captured railway lines could not simply be used at full speed without conversion. Trucks broke down, horses remained essential. Fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and winter equipment had to move farther and farther from German bases. Every mile of advance stretched the army that had made the advance possible. A panzer column that looked unstoppable at the front could be fragile if the supply system behind it was exhausted. The second reason was Soviet recovery. Joseph Stalin and Soviet commanders made grave errors before and during the opening phase, but the state did not surrender. New formations were raised, factories were evacuated eastward, commanders learned under terrible pressure. Ordinary soldiers, party officials, workers, railway crews, and civilians were mobilized into a survival effort that became central to the war. German planners had expected political collapse. Instead, violence, occupation policy, and the defense of home territory helped produce ferocious resistance. The invasion also unleashed occupation policies that should not be separated from the military campaign. Behind the front, German security units, SS formations, police battalions, and collaborators carried out mass shootings, anti-Jewish violence, starvation policies, and reprisals. The Holocaust escalated dramatically in the territories invaded after June 22. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war would die from neglect, starvation, exposure, and murder. Civilians were treated as expendable or as enemies. Barbarossa was therefore a military turning point and a human catastrophe. By late summer and autumn, German armies had won huge tactical victories but had not destroyed the Soviet Union. The road to Moscow became the symbolic focus. Army Group Center pushed toward the Soviet capital in Operation Typhoon. The capture of Moscow might have damaged rail networks, morale, and administration. It would not necessarily have ended the war, but both sides understood the city's importance. As German units approached, Soviet resistance hardened, reserves arrived, and the weather worsened. The German army was not prepared for the campaign it had actually created. The autumn mud slowed movement, winter equipment was insufficient, vehicles and weapons suffered. Soldiers faced temperatures and conditions for which rapid victory assumptions had left them badly supplied, but weather alone did not defeat Barbarossa. The offensive failed because its political and military assumptions were wrong. The Red Army was wounded but not destroyed. Soviet industry and manpower survived. German logistics were overextended. Occupation brutality hardened resistance, and Hitler's strategic ambitions exceeded German capacity. In December 1941, Soviet counteroffensives near Moscow pushed exhausted German forces back. The image of German invincibility was broken. Germany had not taken Moscow, had not knocked the Soviet Union out of the war, and now faced a conflict of attrition against a state it had underestimated. That same month, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Germany declared war on the United States. The war became even more global. Barbarossa had begun as Hitler's attempt to secure a continental empire. It helped create the conditions for Germany's eventual encirclement by enemies with greater resources. The consequences reached far beyond military operations. The Eastern Front became the central land theater of the war in Europe. It consumed men, machines, food, fuel, and political attention on a scale unmatched elsewhere. Battles such as Leningrad, Stalingrad, Kursk, and the later Soviet offensives cannot be understood without the decision made in 1941. Barbarossa began the road to those disasters and victories. It also exposed the central contradiction of Nazi strategy. A regime driven by ideological conquest had chosen a war whose material demands it could not sustain. For civilians in the invaded regions, the date marked the beginning of occupation, siege, displacement, famine, forced labor, mass murder, and partisan war. Villages and cities became battlefields. Jewish communities faced systematic killing. Soviet prisoners disappeared into camps and open-air enclosures. Families were split by evacuation, conscription, deportation, and frontline collapse. The vast arrows on operational maps can hide that reality. Every advance line passed through lived places, and every encirclement trapped human beings inside military diagrams. For Germany, the first day's apparent triumph contained the seeds of defeat. The campaign had no modest endpoint. It required the destruction of armies, seizure of resources, occupation of huge territories, and political collapse of a state that kept fighting. Each partial success demanded another push deeper east. Each delay made the next phase harder. By choosing a war of annihilation against the Soviet Union, Hitler had tied Germany's future to a gamble in which early victory needed to be total and fast. It was neither. That is why June 22, 1941, remains one of the decisive dates of the 20th century. It was not just the opening of another front. It was the moment Nazi Germany turned from a series of rapid wars into a continental struggle against distance, industry, manpower, ideology, and time. The guns that fired before dawn announced more than an invasion. They announced the beginning of the war that would break the Third Reich.